Good evening, and welcome to Making Change Radio. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and joining me tonight is Dale Brumfield. He's a journalist, author, cultural archaeologist, and an anti-death penalty advocate, which is where we met. Welcome, Dale.
Thank you for having me, Catherine.
So the subject this evening is Jamestown. Yes, we have an event coming up next week, which a lot of people are aware of, to commemorate the 400th anniversary of the founding of our legislature. But there's a lot of history about Jamestown that didn't quite make it into our fourth grade Virginia history books. Did you read that one, Dale?
I probably did, and I probably read the worst version possible, the one created by the Byrd administration in the 1940s.
Wow. So I'm trying to think which version I had. I would have been in fourth grade in like 1970, I think.
Oh, I was in fourth grade in 1968.
Right.
So, yeah.
It's very similar.
Very close.
Probably the same version. But, you know, they really told a very different story.
Very different. Back in the late 1940s, you know, the Byrd administration hired politicians to write the history books as a kind of a blowback against the Truman administration. And so they started writing these history books, and they were painting a lot of Virginia history in very glowing terms, especially slavery, and especially the arrival of African Americans in Virginia. For example, I remember one line in one of the books said that slaves didn't have to worry about working as hard as hourly employees because they didn't have to worry about losing their jobs.
Yeah, right. The upside of enslavement.
The upside of slavery. These books were incredibly slanted, but they were used, and they were being used up into the 1970s. So one of the reasons for what we're talking about tonight and the problems with Virginians facing with women, with race relations, gender relations, class relations, stems from the poor formation that all the baby boomers have had from those terrible history books.
Well, and so let's roll it back to how words matter, right?
Right.
So, you know, the celebration on Tuesday is all about the successful founding of the world's oldest operating legislature in the Western Hemisphere. And that sounds like, wow, something Virginians should be proud of. Like, look at us. We did this thing, and it lasted a really long time.
And in a lot of ways, it is something to be proud of. I mean, the resiliency of those early settlers was remarkable. They went through a terrible time, and there were some things that happened along the way, though, however, that were mostly a direct result of British colonial law, which is the most strict law in the world.
Right. So let's just talk about colonialism, specifically British colonialism, specifically white colonialism. At one point, there was a saying that the sun never set on the British Empire.
Right.
They colonized Africa and India and the United States. And so this is not necessarily a good thing if you're the people already living there. So like the Native Americans, they did not arrive on shores where nobody was living here. It
was the same thing that happened in India. The same thing that happened in the African nations, and it kept repeating itself, and it happened in America. Although it happened much earlier than some of the other Indian and African colonization, but it's the same thing. The treatment of indigenous peoples, they were just seen as in the way. We are the British. We are taking over. We know what's best. You need to back out. So that's what happened.
So don't you think? I personally think it's rather remarkable that the only woman that history remembers or glorifies is Pocahontas.
That's correct.
Pocahontas. Her portrait hangs in the U.S. Capitol. She's the only woman whose portrait hangs in the Virginia Capitol. And this is a woman who is practically deified because she saved one white man from death, John Smith, and married another one, John Rolfe. Like, that was her contribution.
Yeah, and what we need to remember, too, is unlike the way she was portrayed in the Disney movies and many of our history books, we have to remember she was about 12 years old when she married John Smith, or when she married when she married John Rolfe.
Right.
She was about 12 years old. She was bald. She was malnourished. Probably not the type of person that we would think of as a hero. And so it's astonishing how this reality is just running into this mythology that has been created around Pocahontas. And she literally, you're right, is the only woman from colonial Virginia that we have even heard of. Another woman we never heard of in colonial Virginia was someone named Jane Champion. Now, Jane Champion in 1632 became the first woman to be executed in the New World here in Jamestown. And you know why she was executed? For concealing childbirth. That was considered a capital crime in those early colonial days. Because remember, in 1611, Thomas Dale reintroduced British colonial law because Jamestown was a shambles at the time. And so those British colonial laws were incredibly strict. And they were designed to do one thing and one thing only, not to help the settlers, but to protect the British investors in the Virginia Company. So even in 1611, the government was looking out for the investors over the citizens. So that set a precedent that has continued for over 400 years as well.
So you said her name was Jane Champion?
Jane Champion.
Jane Champion, who I'm sure none of our listeners have ever heard of, and why would they? But let's talk about, when you talk about how the history has echoed over 400 years from that time to this time, the fact that this is the first woman, I'm assuming she was hung.
Yes, she was.
She was hung. Well, they didn't burn her, tied to a stake or anything, so I guess, as executions go, possibly more humane, but for concealing childbirth. Now, how did she get pregnant, Dale? I realize you're a cultural archaeologist, but I don't think it was by herself. And it probably, and this is where, who tells the story? Who tells the story? Because there are people who would blame her for being unmarried and pregnant and trying to conceal this childbirth, but no one would leap immediately to rape in a colony where the men outnumbered the women, like, who knows, 20 to 1.
And not only that, but the men had total control over the lives of the women. If we even back up to 1610, there was an incident that occurred in 1610. An English nobleman killed his wife during the starving time and said he cannibalized her. Now, he could get away with it because he could make the case at the time that he needed to kill and eat his wife to survive. He was a nobleman and entitled to do such a thing. However, being a nobleman, he did a terrible job burying his wife after claiming that he had cannibalized her. And when her body was found, he was executed by burning at the stake.
Wow.
So those laws were quite rigid and quite rough. So that was the first case of a woman being subjugated in Jamestown in 1610. We move ahead to 1632 to Jane Champion. There is speculation. Some historians think they know who the husband was. And he was not, he received a slap on the wrist. I think he had to spend a day in a stockade.
Well, it's probably because he came from a good family.
Exactly.
If people are just joining us, I want to introduce you to my guest, Dale Brumfield. He is, in fact, a cultural archaeologist, as well as a journalist and an author. And our subject tonight is Jamestown here on Radio Fairfax, because we are coming up on a very big celebration next week. And what we're celebrating is basically the survival of our legislature. But here on Making Change Radio, what we like to point out are the people who actually made change and are making change. And we need to change the narrative. And that's why I invited Dale on, because I think Dale has spent his career trying to change the narrative about the history of Virginia.
Thank you, Catherine. Yeah, it's some of the more sinister aspects. And it's not that I'm got a grudge or a bone to pick with the state or anything, but this formation that I personally received was so bad. I remember being in high school in 1972, and our high school was a small rural high school in Western Virginia. We still had slave auctions.
Oh, in the high school.
In the high school, where an upperclassman, usually an athlete, would stand on a box in the gym and underclassmen would bid on him. Never a woman. It was never a female athlete, because there weren't that many, quite frankly, at that time. So it was a male athlete, and you get his services for the day. He'd carry your books, go get your lunch, that type of thing. And it was called a slave auction. And those things were still, and nobody thought a thing about it. And it's because we just didn't get the formation in our earlier years of how bad slavery was and how bad these auctions and what a terrible image we are projecting to each other by doing this. So this was all part of what goes back to our formation, what we learn and what we know about Virginia and how we have learned it. 1608, for example, if you want to go back to the very beginning, Jamestown was settled in 1607. 1608 was a critical year for two reasons. In 1608, Virginia held its first execution. Now, I'm an anti-death penalty advocate, and I know the history of executions pretty well. Virginia executed a man for conspiring with the Spanish against the British. His name was Captain George Kendall. He was shot by firing squad. He was the first execution. Also that year, a group of people showed up in Jamestown, a group of immigrants.
Immigrants here
Yes.
in America.
In 1608. And guess what? They were white immigrants, too. They were from Poland, and they were brought to Virginia for glass blowing. They needed artisans for glass, and so they brought these Poles in, and these Poles worked for many, many years just blowing glass, but they had difficulty inserting themselves into the Virginia society. And why is that? Well, actually, we have some information about that, do we not?
We do, because, I did not realize this until I read an editorial in the Roanoke Times. And the editorial, which was published on July 16th in the Roanoke Times, is called "Trump Has It Wrong. He Seems to Be the One Who Hates America," which is pretty brave because Roanoke is in Southwest Virginia, for people who may not know geography, and the readership down there is not on board with this message. But when I was reading this, I was absolutely stunned when I read, and I will read from the editorial, 1 year after Jamestown's founding, the English began bringing in immigrants from Poland who were famed for their glass-blowing skills, as you just talked about. When the colony was allowed to elect its first government, the House of Burgesses, in 1619, the forerunner of today's state government, the governor tried to limit the vote only to Englishmen. The Poles promptly went on strike, and within weeks the English relented. On July 21st, 1619, the English decreed about the Poles, and I quote, "It was now agreed, notwithstanding any former order to the contrary, that they shall be enfranchised and made as free as any inhabitant there whatsoever." You can make a case that the notion of America really began that day, when Polish immigrants were recognized as equal to the English as part of the Virginia experiment. I had no idea until I read that.
That's a pretty bold move on the Polish's part for going on strike. It just goes to show that going on strike can have an effect, even at that period. And they were at such a disadvantage at the time, but they were able to go on strike and work to make themselves equal with the English noblemen, which seems like a nearly impossible task, but they managed to pull it off. So hats off to the Poles of 1619 in Virginia for doing that.
Well, I can tell you they did not make an appearance in the fourth grade Virginia history book, and I dare say they're not there now.
No, I dare say you're exactly right. I never heard that either certainly not from my history books in school, for sure.
So let's talk about the indigenous people too. One of the, Thanksgiving, Columbus Day, very, very problematic holidays. They're part of the cultural fabric of the United States, and yet they are problematic. People were living here, and even though the portrait that is painted is one of cooperation, the fact of the matter is it was genocide, which is a very unhappy word. It's an ugly word to say that the people who came here as colonists systematically killed Indians.
That's correct.
Intentionally.
And what I remember from my history books, them saying they lived in harmony. I guess it is harmony if you have a 10-to-1 advantage with firearms over a group of indigenous people. And so they just, like I said, the English would just push them aside. It's a subjugation of a race. So we see it constantly. Push them aside, push them onto the reservations where they remain today. But this is the white supremacy of the time. It's so unfortunate that we just see example after example throughout history and even into today of this type of subjugation of a race. It started with the Indians, with the African Americans, and which started with the Poles. So it's a very unfortunate situation for sure, and one that we just weren't taught any different of.
And again, going back to your echo analogy of how it just echoes through the ages. We couldn't pass the ERA. we couldn't pass the ERA because Republicans, who, by the way, in the legislature are 100% white, I do believe,
I think so.
and predominantly male,
Right.
prevented the ERA from getting out of committee into a floor vote.
Right.
So tell me how much progress we made in 400 years.
Well, there's a committee in the House. It's the House Courts of Justice Subcommittee, and maybe other committees too. Bills with repealing the death penalty have run into the same roadblocks. Remember this past year, the habitual drunkard law, which has been on the books since 1830, got killed by the same committee. So it's like if there's something progressive to be done, it's going to die with the Republican subcommittee. It seems like the ERA, a perfect example of that. Our cause is a perfect example of it. So,
right. So the fact of the matter is that the fact that the ERA, after 400 years, could not even get a floor vote in the longest operating legislature in the Western Hemisphere says something that is not good about the history of Virginia. And when we go to celebrate next week, I do not believe anyone will be talking about that.
That celebration is going to be an interesting case because, as you know, the president has been invited, and now many Democrats are dropping out of the celebration. Today, Richmond Mayor LeVar Stoney, who was a black man.
He was on the commission.
He was on the commission. He has resigned from that commission because of that. And it makes me wonder what the governor is thinking now.
There was a lot of controversy about why he was invited. But I pointed out, again, you have to read the fine print. Please, people, read the fine print. He was invited a year ago in 2018. That the governor was acting in his capacity as the governor, so was the Speaker of the House, so was the Senate Majority Leader. All of them did what they thought was the right thing, which was to invite the President of the United States. I get that. But between that invitation and his statements 2 weeks ago, the game has changed.
Right.
It's changed.
It changes with this president on a daily basis. And one thing about Virginia, to look at a bigger picture, Virginia can't let go of anything.
Oh, yes,
as you well know.
Yes.
And I want to give one big example that I worked on. I wrote a story about this, is Virginia's state song. Now, for many, many years, Virginia had a state song, Carrying Me Back to Old Virginia. Now, if you're not familiar with this song, it's it's good for you, but you need to look up at it because it was our state song until 1997. This is a song that features words like darky and massa, and the theme of the song is about a black former slave who's pining for the old pre-emancipation days of slavery so he can live on the plantation with his master.
Live out the mythology.
Live out the mythology.
If you're just joining us, this is Making Change Radio. I'm your host, Catherine Reed. Joining me tonight is Dale Brumfield. He is a journalist, author, and a cultural archaeologist. And what we're examining tonight is trying to make change around how we talk about Virginia's very complicated history in an honest and authentic way. Because you can't really change your present if you don't understand where it came from. And I will always say, and I will stand by the fact that our history does not dictate our future. It doesn't. But you have to understand how we got here and why we're here and why there are so many things we seem to be stuck at. And the ERA is just one of the things that we just seem to be stuck because we have this history, to your point, that people in elected office do not want to let go.
One of the things to look at, too, and I do want to get back to the state song situation in a minute, but what occurred to me, the Jeffrey Epstein case recently, is yet another case of white patriarchy subjugating women for their own ends. And so this is something that we keep seeing. We keep seeing it playing over and over, the echo effect. I think this is yet another case of it. Now, it's not strictly a Virginia thing, but it's...
Well, you can look at the Catholic Church and the priests. Same thing. This is all patriarchy. It is men doing what they want and being protected by other men because men still run governments, legislatures, boardrooms, faith communities. Men are still in charge.
I remember one particular Republican legislator at the beginning of the 2018 General Assembly session was talking about the recent election and how a lot of women were coming into the GA. And this particular man said, people come in here thinking they're going to make a difference. think again, to
Yeah.
paraphrase him.
Yeah.
And he was bragging that they couldn't come in and make a difference because the white men were still running the show.
And see, this is all the argument about whether the Democrats should or should not be at this ceremony on Tuesday. You know, my point of view is that if you take the Democrats out of the equation and what you see is the remaining legislators, they are white and predominantly male. And in fact, it looks very much like the House of Burgesses, except for a few skirts and no powdered wigs.
Exactly. I've been an anti-death penalty vendor at CPAC, the Conservative Political Action Committee in D.C. for the last 2 years, and I can assure you it is an ocean of white men.
Yeah. And so Virginians have to look at why we have not made more progress and better progress. And I go back to the mythology that continues to be perpetuated, and we teach it to generation after generation after generation of children, to the point where they accept that our mythology is history, and it is not.
And one of the things that I talk to people about a lot is the difference between history and nostalgia. I think one of the things when we talk about the Confederate monuments, for example, in Richmond, people say, don't remove them, they're history. I would argue, not exactly. They're nostalgia. They were built for nostalgic purposes. They were built to take Virginia back to the antebellum days, the old days, the pre-Civil War, to commemorate this lost cause and
Yeah, it
how
was
we
called
fought
the
for
Lost
what we
Cause
thought was
movement.
right. And so now we've got these monuments sitting down here, and you know, as a white person, I walked by them a million times and never thought a thing about it. But then I started talking to more of my black friends in Richmond. I said, how do you feel about walking past these monuments? And they say, it's awful. Says, I can't, I stay off. I don't even go down Monument Avenue. You know, I'm hearing things, and that never occurred to me. So this has been such an eye-opening experience for me too, because I'm seeing things through a lens that I previously never did, because being a white male who's now 60 years old, I just didn't see things, and I didn't grow up learning them, and I don't see them now. So I've had to re-engineer my own thought processes toward this.
Well, that's what white privilege is. White privilege is we don't have to think about these things.
Right. They
We
don't
get up
affect
every
us.
day and we don't have to think about these things.
Exactly.
That's what white privilege is. You know, people take it so personally. It's not personal. It's what we have. It's who we are, and our life has given us this thing where we don't have to worry about what many other people that we live with have to think about. And you know, and again, we changed a high school up here from Jeb Stuart High School to Justice High School. It caused quite the uproar. And again, Civil War history, Civil War history, Civil War history. The name of that school was made Jeb Stuart High School in 1954. Well, what was happening in 1954? Oh, let me think. Brown versus the Board of Education and massive resistance.
Exactly.
This is not a school that was named in 1865. This was a message. It was a message about who we glorify and what our supposed values are.
I write history columns for the Stanton News Leader newspaper in Stanton, Virginia. And they recently changed the school, Robert E. Lee High School, to Stanton High School, created the same swarm of controversy. One of the things that I point out would be, in this case, that Robert E. Lee was named, it was called originally Stanton High School until about 1925, 1926 or so, when they changed it to Robert E. Lee, in a drive led by who else but the United Daughters of the Confederacy, who were a group of women who had more power than they probably should have.
Because they could fundraise.
Because they could fundraise.
Because they could fundraise.
They sure could. And they were driving force behind many Confederate monuments, behind many of these school name changes. And so Robert E. Lee was changed. Meanwhile, in Stanton, at the same time, they had a black high school, Booker T. Washington High School. And in 1967, they merged the two together. Well, what happened to Booker T. Washington? Gone.
Erased.
It's erased.
It's erased.
And you could make the argument. One who tells me that we're changing the name of Lehigh to Stanton is erasing history. Well, we sure erased history when they took out Booker T. Washington High School. And I thought it'd be a great idea to name the new high school Booker T. Washington High School. But they went with Stanton instead. But that just shows you, what about those students? What about their history? What about what they endured when that happened in the late 60s? It doesn't seem to matter. We're just going to keep doing things the way we think, the way white people think they need to be done.
You know, and that's the other thing that it stuns me that people don't question why we have so many Confederate statues. Virginia, and I read this somewhere, can't call up that footnote right now, but read somewhere that we have more Confederate statues than any state in the nation. Any of the other states, of the 50 states, including the ones that are in the far deep South, more so than we are, but we have more of them. And yet, our history starts in 1607,
Right.
and this is 4 years. 4 years, like our history is boiled down to more than 400 years to 4 years.
Right.
The sum total of everything Virginia is, anything we ever did, anything we ever stood for, is really boiled down to 4 years where we left the Union, committed treason, and lost a war.
Yeah, no one should be defined by their one worst thing or their worst idea or their one bad deed. It takes 400 years to define and a whole lifetime to define it. By defining Virginia by those 4 years is really unfair and does a disservice to all of the history that happened before and after that.
You're absolutely right. We are going to take a short break. We hope you'll come back to hear more about our history.
We are Radio Fairfax.
Rivers of Living Water is a program that features uplifting sermons, abundant grace, unwavering faith, spirit-led life, work of the cross of Jesus in the radical of our Heavenly Father.
You're a good, good father.
Tune in to Rivers of Living Water, Fridays at 4 p.m. on Radio Fairfax.
It's who you are.
Hello, my name's Matthew Moore, the host of the Psychedelic Circus. The circus has moved. I'm on Sunday nights now from 6 to 8 p.m. Join me for the Psychedelic Circus, where the buzz can shake you clean.
In 1957, Frank Sinatra said,
"Rock and roll smells phony and false. It is sung, played, and written for the most part by cretinous goons. It manages to be the martial music of every sideburn delinquent on the face of the earth. It is the most brutal, ugly, desperate, vicious form of expression it's ever been my misfortune to hear."
Way to go, Frank. If you agree with him, good luck to you. But if you want to hear some good early rock and roll and rockabilly, tune in every Thursday at 4 p.m. to The Professor Rocks.
There are a ton of social networking websites, but one stands apart for a very special reason. This one saves lives. It's MatchingDonors.com. MatchingDonors.com links organ donors with people in need of kidney and other transplants. In the U.S., 19 people die each day waiting for an organ transplant, most of them for kidneys. If you've ever considered becoming a living organ donor, or if you're someone in need of an organ transplant, visit MatchingDonors.com, home of the greatest gift of all, the gift of life, MatchingDonors.com.
An important message from Medicare.
When my son first told me about extra help from Medicare, I said, thanks, but no thanks. I didn't want any help paying for my prescriptions. I told him, I don't have much money coming in, but I still have my pride. Besides, I looked into it a couple years ago. I figured if I didn't qualify then, I wouldn't qualify now either. My, oh my, am I ever glad my son didn't give up on me. He reminded me that I was on a limited income and that it was easier than ever for people like me to qualify. So I called, and he was right. Now I pay just a few dollars for generics and a few dollars more for brand name prescriptions. With extra help, I can afford the prescriptions I need. Thanks, Medicare.
Get the extra help you need to stay healthy. Visit socialsecurity.gov or call 1-800-772-1213.
Radio Fairfax is a 501c3 nonprofit based in Fairfax, Virginia.
Keeping the First Amendment alive. We are Radio Fairfax, Fairfax County's public access and internet radio station.
Welcome back to Making Change Radio. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and joining me tonight is Dale Brumfield. He is a journalist, author, cultural archaeologist, and we met because he's also an anti-death penalty advocate. So, Dale, we were talking about, when we went on break, about how people don't understand the trajectory of our history or when things, on what timeline things happened.
Right.
And so going a little bit farther back to Jamestown, we talk about, the fact that we are the longest operating legislature. It is something to be proud of. I don't want to take anything away from our legislature or the accomplishment of keeping this legislature alive. But I don't want also for us to lose sight of the fact that it was still colonialism. And a lot of people paid a steep price for the success of our colony.
Right, exactly what we were saying, like I was talking about in the first segment. The Thomas Dale laws of 1611 carried all the way through to 1785. Even during the Revolutionary War, Virginia was still clinging to those colonial British laws. And we saw instances of some terrible things. We talked about one burning at the stake of a man, but we also had a burning at the stake in 1738 in Orange County of a slave, a black woman who had supposedly poisoned her owner. She was burned at the stake in Orange. We had another woman whose actually head was removed after she was hung and placed on a pole outside of Augusta County. And so these were meant to be deterrents, and these were part of the British colonial rule that was still in place that was designed solely to protect the early Virginia company investors. But even long after that situation had transpired, we still cling to those rules because, again, the Virginia General Assembly is very slow letting go of anything, and they simply could not let go of those laws until finally Thomas Jefferson in 1785 stood up and said, enough is enough. We've got to reform our criminal justice system. We're killing people and putting them in the stockades, and doing this is ridiculous, and we won't attract business or more immigrants to America, which he realized were needed if we're going to keep treating people like this. So finally, but it took 1796 before Virginia truly reformed her criminal justice system.
That's a long time, 1607 to 1796. That's almost 200 years.
That's almost 200 years. So it was even by today's standards, that's a long time.
It is. And so when our founding fathers tried to put together a constitution and a federal form of government, which basically said some rights we're going to keep for the federal government and some rights are going to be with the state. And this has also created a tension that was supposed to keep a balance.
Correct.
Right? So, because they didn't want a monarchy. The whole thing about 3 strong branches of government, which is being sorely tested right now in 2019, but 3 strong equal branches of government, and this tension between what is the purview of the federal government and what is the purview of the state government. And nowhere do we see this writ large than in the Second Amendment.
Right. The Second Amendment has become quite a battleground. And most there's a one side who take a very black and white approach to the Second Amendment, and it is sacrosanct. It is written the way it is, and that's how it shall remain. Any attempt to abridge or change that amendment is wrong and is unconstitutional. We especially saw that this summer with the Virginia General Assembly when they convened at Governor Northam's request to debate gun violence. I was in Virginia Beach the night of the mass shooting. I was about 10 minutes away from it. I saw firsthand the chaos, the confusion, the turmoil that such a thing creates. And that, once again, it takes a personal experience like that to truly open your eyes and see what's going on. So when I heard that Governor Northam was convening a special session of the GA to address that and an episode like the Virginia Tech shooting, I was very glad to hear it because I said this is something we need to do. We got to do something. But then the GA convened. 2 or 4 hours later, they were out of there at a total cost of about $45,000 to Virginia taxpayers. Nothing happened. I was shocked but not surprised because, again, most of these leadership in the GA are very Second Amendment oriented. They have a very black and white view of it, and they are not willing to bend in any shape or form against it.
So you can understand that back in the late 1700s, when they were putting together the Constitution, and it had just come through a revolution, that guaranteeing the right to bear arms, to form a militia,
right? Because
we did not have a standing military. At least, and George Washington thought we should never have a standing military. He wasn't the only one. Eisenhower wasn't keen on the amount or the size of our defense industrial complex either.
Yeah, he warned very harsh about that.
Did both Washington and Eisenhower said it's a mistake, and now look at the size of our budget that goes into defense. But let's not digress. So when they were coming up and saying, because people have to defend their property, and remember too, property. To your point about investors, meeting the needs of investors, it was about property.
Exactly.
Both the kind on the ground and what came to be the human beings that people owned. It was about your property.
Correct.
And so you had to defend your property, and therefore you had to have a guarantee of the right to bear arms for that purpose.
Exactly. And guns fired about 3 bullets a minute. At that time, when that was written?
Yeah, muskets, man.
I can't see how the Founding Fathers could possibly have envisioned bump stocks or repeaters or silencers or any of these things that have then since come out of that Second Amendment proponents lump into the right to bear arms. You know, the right to bear arms is on the same level as the right to bear a bump stock or to bear a silencer or to bear a magazine that'll hold 32 rounds or 33 rounds. Versus what we were doing at the time.
A musket, you know,
versus a musket.
And again, you know, and it's in order to defend this unquestioningly, so much policy has been around restricting things like the CDC collecting information about gun violence as a public safety issue. Like, if you don't know how many people are being killed, you can't be as an alarm. But we know that it's about 95 people a day die of gun violence in this country, and 10 of them are children.
Yep.
Children. Now, I can see our founding fathers sitting around going, I don't know, 95 people a day, 10 kids a day being shot and killed. I don't know. It seems like it's an okay trade-off for that Second Amendment right to bear arms.
Even if we proportionalized it to the population at the time, the per capita, it's still an astonishing number. So you're right. There's no way that they could have envisioned such a thing at the time. But it's funny too, in my work, for all the ones who are so strong supporters of the Second Amendment, they seem to not have that strength to other amendments, in particular the Eighth Amendment, about cruel and unusual. The government shall not enact cruel and unusual punishment. And we see that today with the federal government.
Ripped right out of the headlines.
Ripped right out of the headlines when the Attorney General Barr has announced that the federal government will resume federal executions on a federal level. That goes right back to what we were just talking about.
Right.
So, you know, the Eighth Amendment. So where does the Eighth Amendment fall? What is considered cruel and unusual? Well, that's the fight that's doing it. But whenever a life is involved, we need to step back a step. We need to step back because it is a life is being involved here.
So for those of you who may just be tuning in, this is Making Change Radio here on Radio Fairfax. I'm your host, Catherine Reed. And my expert guest tonight is Dale Brumfield, who is a journalist, author, and cultural archaeologist. And he knows a lot about the death penalty because he advocates to abolish it. And so when we talk about the proliferation of firearms past anything the original signers of the Constitution could have imagined, you know, things creep up on us. The opioid epidemic is another one where, again, there was a Washington Post article talking about how in Norton, Virginia, which is the smallest independent city in Virginia, with 3,000 plus inhabitants of that city, pills were being prescribed at a rate of something like 326 pills in a year for every man, woman, and child that lived there.
An astonishing.
But see, here's the thing: pharmacies, we have data. We know, right? Because it's regulated. Isn't it regulated? It is regulated. So they didn't pull that number out of thin air. They didn't. But with firearms, who knows how many they are, what they are, where they are, or who owns them?
Gun runners running up and down the East Coast who have been arrested have laughed at Virginia, at the ease in which they can get guns here in Virginia. And we know that the guns in Virginia are being carried north and are being used.
Well, that's why they had the one gun per month, which was repealed.
Right, it was repealed.
It was repealed. It's like, well, that didn't change anything. Well, how would we know? Because we're prohibited from collecting data about it.
Exactly. So we'll never know the facts about it. So there's no way to enact legislation if we have no data to back it up. So that's a situation that, and Virginia is really good at creating these situations where it's impossible to go back and determine. They just make a law because, well, we got no data to back it up. We talk about going back to the death penalty just for a minute. Sometimes people ask me, well, you talk about the potential of an innocent person being on death row, but Virginia has never proven that anyone executed in this state was ever innocent after execution. And I tell them there's a good reason for that. One, we have a 21-day rule in which a defense attorney only has 21 days and only 21 days to introduce any new evidence, potentially exculpatory or exonerating evidence against someone who has been convicted. And two, if an execution does occur, by law, all the evidence in that case is incinerated. It is destroyed.
That's crazy.
So no one can ever come back. Now, Virginia enacted that law under the auspices of, well, we've got no defendant, so there can be no evidence against them. So they came up with this law to incinerate it. It was really a CYA law. We're just going to protect ourselves,
true,
so we can never prove.
But DNA has upended that.
DNA is upending that. But what we got to remember with DNA, it's only available in 5 to 10% of criminal cases, capital cases especially. And number two, look what happened in Massachusetts this summer. They found out the prosecutors were conspiring with a laboratory, and now this lab technician has been sent to prison for many, many years for falsifying reports. And these prosecutors, of course, prosecutors can mostly walk most of the time. There's no prosecutor accountability in most states. But they have found that almost 10,000 cases now have to be re-reviewed because of wonky DNA work So it's not the be-all, end-all.
No, there are bad actors everywhere. We have to assume there are bad actors everywhere.
DNA can be a great thing. It has gotten people off.
It has, and it has proven innocence.
And we need innocence. It has proven actual innocence. We do need it. Many of these exonerations that the Innocence Project are working on off of death rows around America are due to DNA evidence, sometimes 10, 20, 30 years after the case.
I know, which is a sad situation. Let's
Terrible.
Let's go down a bunny trail with this for a minute. The fact that mass incarceration is a problem, people being unjustly convicted and jailed for many years, disproportionately affect men of color. People of color, men of color. Again, let's talk about our echoes all the way back to Jamestown. And the fact that we processed, brought in, sold more slaves than any other state in the United States as a colony. That is a fact. They came through Virginia, they were sold and taken to South Carolina and to Georgia and Alabama. There is so much responsibility that we have. And to this day, it echoes. Jim Crow, which, the civil rights movement was supposed to attack Jim Crow, and yet there always seems to be a workaround. Mass incarcerations are one of those workarounds.
Mass incarceration, to me, is really a despicable echo of the black codes of the post-Civil War. If you may recall that after the Civil War, the Virginia legislature, most of the southern states enacted what they called black codes, which were just laws that were designed to entrap young black men in frequently nonsense crimes because they needed to Reconstruction was going on. These states needed to rebuild. They needed to build railroads. They needed to mine. They needed to start quarries and mine granite and do all these things to get their economies going again, but they needed cheap labor to do it. There's no cheaper labor than convict labor. So they enacted these black codes to entrap these young black men, and then they can send these young black men to work on railroads. This happened frequently. I recently wrote a story about the legend of John Henry, who originated right here in Virginia. John Henry was a young black man who was arrested in 1869 for breaking into a house. He got 10 years. He was sent to Talcott, West Virginia, to work in the Big Bend Tunnel, where, like many of those black convict laborers, got silicosis from breathing sandstone dust in the tunnels, and then which eventually leads to pneumonia. They have to be shipped back to the penitentiary. They died and were buried. Now, recently, at the old site of the old Richmond Penitentiary, back in 1992, when they demolished the facility, they discovered a mass grave, and it was the largest mass grave in Virginia. To this day, over 300 skeletons were uncovered in a grave that no one knew about. And now, 27 years later, to show how long it takes, because they knew they were African Americans. They've been laying on a shelf in the Smithsonian, but now finally in 2019, a group is coming together to raise money and to start working on these skeletons to find out, number one, a descendant community, and number two, to see if they can find out through the descendant community who many of these skeletons are. There are women, there are children, there are men. They found lesions on their ribs, which would show silicosis or tuberculosis or some other type of. So these things are happening, but it's taken 27 years to do this. Once the skeletons were uncovered, up until right now, this work is finally starting. And so that is why some of the Black Burial Ground, the Sacred Burial Ground organization in Richmond is behind this too, because they want to get a memorial. Right now there's no memory, there's no memorial, nobody knows anything about it. So this is yet another situation where they were black skeletons, but they were put on the shelf.
And this is also history that isn't taught. Convict labor did, in fact, build roads, bridges, tunnels, and they were rounded up on things like loitering, and they were literally put out to work, and they were worked to death.
Worked to death.
Worked to death. Where is that in the history books? And even now, in prisons, you've got people who have jobs. Well, let's talk about the firefighters. The firefighters out in California, I think they were earning $2 a day.
$2 a day, yeah.
To fight those wildfires in California. They were convict labor.
Right. That's the same thing. It's convict labor. Working side by side with a firefighter getting
a professional
their
firefighter, right?
Normal salary, and this person is getting $2 a day, subjected to the same dangers, the same risks. So same thing. And people say, well, they need something to do. They were volunteering to do it. I would like to back up for a minute and address that situation, because I did an article once called The African Dodger. And this was a case of white supremacy in the form of a carnival game. In the 1880s, this guy came up with a game called the African Dodger. And I'll tell you about it in just a second.
Well, if you're just joining us and you're interested in the African Dodger, it's because you're listening to Making Change Radio. I'm your host, Catherine Reed. My guest is Dale Brumfield, who is a journalist, author, and cultural archaeologist, and he knows a lot about a lot of things. And what we're doing with Change Tonight is we're working on changing your mind about what you think you know about Virginia history.
Well, what you're talking about changing your mind about Virginia history. This is probably a story that our history books did not touch either. But in the 1880s, they came up with a carnival game called the African Dodger. What this game was a white carnival barker put up a piece of canvas. He cut a hole in the middle of it, and a black man put his head in the hole. And then other white men would pay a nickel for 3 baseballs to throw at him. And the object was to hit him with the baseball in the face with the baseballs. It was called Dodger because he could duck and miss. They said a good Dodger can earn $5 a day. Believe it or not, this game went on until the 1940s. And so we still had black men who put their head through a hole and white men would throw baseballs at them. Now, I read instances where professional baseball, minor league baseball pitchers would step up and they'd lob a couple of softballs in to throw the guy off, the Dodger, and then he'd hum one in, and there was one instance where a baseball hit a man right in the mouth, broke all his teeth, and he had to cut the ball out of his throat. It was lodged in so tight. Now, people will say, well, the black men were volunteering to put their head through that hole, but what this becomes is yet another form of subjugation, of insisting, and employment was terrible for black men from 1880 to 1940. So if they had an opportunity to earn $5 a day, and then the risk was to get clobbered by a baseball, then they were unfortunately willing to take that risk because they had no other option available to them. So this game, the African Dodger, was nothing more than this continuing subjugation of a minority that started in Jamestown and this continued all the way up into the 1940s. And while the game may have ended, other things were going on in the 50s, 60s, and 70s that continued as well. We kept having minstrel shows in Virginia. Minstrel shows I found one in 1982. They were having a minstrel show in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. So all these things, and we're just having fun, without stopping to think, hey, you know what? It's because your formation is so bad that you don't realize what you're doing.
And here's the other thing. which we haven't brought up, is redlining. Redlining is when you told people of color, any color, every color, black people, Native Americans, whatever, non-white people, where they could live. And mortgage companies, and this was really evident after World War II because there was a GI Bill. And there were black veterans who were eligible for the GI Bill, except there were colleges who wouldn't let them enroll.
Right.
And mortgage companies would not give them a mortgage because they wouldn't give mortgages for the only neighborhoods where these black veterans could live.
Right. Right.
And, you know, there are echoes of that. I just had this conversation today with an old neighbor of mine. I said, whenever you hear someone say, we want to maintain the character of our neighborhood or our neighborhoods, I'm like, think about that for a minute. Who's living in your neighborhood that's low density with big lawns? It's white people. So when people are like, high density housing, it's about the traffic. You know, we all need to check our implicit bias about why we don't want high density housing. It's not just the cars. It's the people we believe live in high density housing.
And Richmond, Virginia is actually starting to address their courts, so to speak, of this high density housing that was built in the 60s that are primarily African Americans
Low
living
income,
in them.
because
They're
it's low income.
One other thing too, and if you think back maybe when you were a child, I remember it well, was the phrase "there goes the neighborhood."
Yep.
And it was a joke. It was a running joke.
Yep.
But nobody stopped to think, what does that line really mean? It means a black family's moved in.
And white flight.
And white flight.
Yep.
The urban renewal of the 60s ties right into that too, because when the interstate highway system was being built, interstate highways going through a city, what part of the city did they go through?
Oh, the
Almost
historically black ones.
universally went through the historically black neighborhoods.
I heard something about John Moses, the architect of New York. You know, he's credited with urban planning, not in the Jane Jacobs School of Urban Planning, but I read this somewhere that the bridges leading from New York to Long Island are so low that buses can't go under those bridges. Why do you think that is? Let's all think together. Who rides buses? Who rides buses?
Exactly.
Why would you make the bridges so low that public buses can't go out to Long Island? You know, no one's teaching this to anyone anywhere.
That's an astonishing statistic. I've never heard that.
I heard that. I did, and I think it was at a museum in New York.
That's crazy.
That's urban planning. But who's doing the urban planning?
Whites.
Yeah. So, you know, I think here in the final minutes of our show, we started out in Jamestown. We ended up in New York, actually Long Island, and that's a long journey. But I think we all have to start to question whether what we believe is mythology or what we know is history. And we have to be open to the fact that maybe there is history that we do not know, and that perhaps because we do not know this history, we don't understand why we believe the things that we believe to this day.
And we need to, and as I said before, we need to distinguish between what's history and what's nostalgia. Nostalgia is inward. This is what appeals to you personally. Do you look back on your childhood and see something or remember something that means a great deal to you? That's nostalgia. History is outward. That's looking out saying, how is this, this really happened, it's really affecting. We need that's why we need to know it. That's why we need to learn it. We don't need to learn nostalgia. That's personal. But we do need to learn history. We need to protect our history. We need to remember it and learn from it, for crying out loud, because we keep making the same mistakes.
And I will give a shout out to the Women's Monument on the grounds of the Capitol in Richmond. The Women's Commission put a lot of effort into creating 12 life-size statues of women of every walk of life in Virginia, which is about time after hundreds of years of only having Pocahontas hanging in our Capitol. And I want to say that there needs to be more of that.
Exactly. It was a great move. And also kudos in Richmond as well for renaming Boulevard to Arthur Ashe Boulevard.
Yes, the Arthur Ashe Boulevard.
And it bisects Monument Avenue and in a very metaphorical and very meaningful way, I think.
I do too. And I will say that I happen to like LeVar Stoney. I've known him for a long time. I think he's a good mayor. He's got a hard job. Richmond is a very divided city.
Very divided, very much so.
But there's a lot of cities around Virginia that are part of that colonial footprint that are divided cities.
Yes, and Virginia too. One thing, there's also the division between Richmond, quote unquote, and RVA, which is the hipster side of Richmond. Yeah. So Richmond is fighting a lot of fronts and a lot of clashing, a lot of things coming together. I'm hoping and I'm praying, and I'm sure that the harmony will remain, and we can continue to be the great city that it is.
Listen, I'm optimistic. I'm a native Virginian. I was born here. My family's been here
Me
since
too.
the beginning. So I am optimistic. I love the fact that we've just been rated as the #1 state in which to do business. We should be proud.
Very proud.
We should be proud of our heritage, but let's all try to be a bit more honest. On Radio Fairfax, this is the Making Change Radio, and I am your host, Catherine Reed.